President Trump will ensure they are hit harder than they have ever been hit before. President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell.
Early today, smoke rose over Kuwait's international airport after an Iranian drone hit a fuel tank there.
From the Iranian point of view, it reads more like a surrender document than the opening of a negotiation.
The clips showed you the threat. What they did not show you is the weakness hidden inside it. Because when a government starts demanding that the enemy admit defeat in public, it is telling you force alone has not finished the job. That is the layer beneath the headline. The White House is talking like a power that wants to sound final, but the reporting says something colder. Trump is looking for an off-ramp, and his exit strategy is unclear. That means the danger in the story is not just escalation, it is escalation mixed with uncertainty, which is how wars turn uglier than anyone planned. A clean victory does not sound like this. A clean victory does not need to swing between we're in control and we need a way out. And that is why the title is so violent when you read it properly. It is not the language of a settled winner. It is the language of a side trying to force political closure before the battlefield produces another surprise. That is why the most important phrase in the title is not hit harder, it is accept defeat. Reuters captured the exact line, and the line gives the whole game away. Washington is not just threatening more force. It is demanding that Tehran ratify America's version of the war, out loud, under pressure, while the war is still alive. That is not routine diplomacy. That is not even normal coercion. That is humiliation as war policy. And humiliation is one of the most dangerous things you can build an endgame around. Because a state can negotiate under pressure, but a regime fighting for survival cannot easily survive being seen to kneel. So when Tehran reads the U.S. proposal as extremely maximalist and unreasonable, that is not just diplomatic pushback. That is Iran saying it does not see a peace offer. It sees a surrender instrument written by the side that thinks bombing has already earned obedience, and once the other side reads your peace track as a surrender track, every next step gets more explosive. That is the real pressure under the clips. Washington wants submission packaged as realism. Tehran wants refusal packaged as resistance, and the audience clicking this title is not here for another official statement. You are here to know whether this is bluff, whether this is the last warning before a harder phase, and whether Iran is actually as cornered as the White House wants you to believe. That is why the Kuwait image matters so much. While Washington talks as if the war is nearing conclusion, smoke is rising over Kuwait International Airport after an Iranian drone hits a fuel tank there. That is not what a contained endgame looks like. That is what a widening battlefield looks like when the rhetoric of closure is running ahead of reality. And that is where the title really cashes in. Accept defeat or get hit harder than ever before lands differently when the war is already bleeding into places outside the core frame. It stops sounding like one more threat and starts sounding like a demand being made before the blast radius expands even further. If you follow this channel for the layer governments are trying not to say directly, stay with me and subscribe now, because this is exactly where the official story starts cracking. And tell me in the comments whether this sounds to you like an off-ramp or the setup for a bigger phase, because from the Gulf to Washington, that is the argument people are already living inside. The one question that should be burning in your head now is simple. If Iran has already been defeated, why does Washington still need Tehran to say it? Because military damage and strategic closure are not the same thing. They never were. You can destroy launchers, air defenses, naval assets, factories, command nodes, and still fail to impose the one outcome that really matters at the end of a war, a stable political finish that everyone else is forced to recognize. That Reuters report is the hard evidence behind the White House confidence. Admiral Brad Cooper said the U.S. had hit over 10,000 targets inside Iran. That is not symbolic warfare. That is a campaign designed to crush capacity, strip options, and convince everyone watching that Iran has already crossed from resistance into punishment without recovery. So no serious viewer should pretend this is all theater. Iran has clearly taken severe military punishment. That much is real. And that is exactly why the next question becomes so much darker. If that level of damage has already been done, why is Washington still speaking like it has one more act to force? The answer is that a state does not have to be strong to remain dangerous. It only has to retain enough leverage to stop the other side from closing the story. It has to retain enough ability to deny calm, deny certainty, deny market stability, deny a clean declaration of victory. That is where this war now lives. And Stephen Hadley says it with brutal clarity. The problem for Trump is the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran can still shape the danger around a waterway through which roughly 20% of global oil and gas exports move, then Washington's battlefield dominance and Washington's political victory are not the same thing. One can be real while the other remains unfinished. That is the hidden nerve of the whole story. The White House wants you focused on what has been destroyed inside Iran, but the strategic question is about what Iran can still deny outside of Iran. As long as Hormuz remains part of the pressure equation, the war remains unfinished in the way that matters most to a president trying to sound like he is wrapping things up. And that is where harder than ever before starts, meaning something far more dangerous than a speech line. It means the current level of damage may still be insufficient to force the outcome Washington wants. It means the administration may believe that what has already been broken is not enough, because Iran still has one unacceptable capability left: the ability to refuse the script. That is why Carolyn Leavitt's other line matters so much. She said the U.S. was very close to meeting the core objectives of Operation Epic Fury, while also saying the mission continues unabated. Those two things do not naturally sit together. If you are close, why the uninterrupted pressure? If pressure remains uninterrupted, how settled is the outcome really? The answer is ugly, but clear. Washington is keeping every option alive because the war has not yet delivered a safe ending. ABC also reports more U.S. forces moving, Marines already involved, paratroopers in the conversation. The 82nd Airborne Division in the broader picture, and a White House determined to preserve escalation options while publicly talking peace. That is not the posture of a side that feels no risk. That is the posture of a side preparing for the possibility that force will have to do even more work. So when the audience clicks this title asking, is this bluff or is this real? The honest answer is this: it can be both. The language can be coercive theater and still signal a real readiness to intensify, because bluffing at this level is not empty. It is a way of trying to avoid the even riskier step of proving the threat. And if the bluff fails, the next phase gets closer. That is what makes this title so clickable right now. People are not clicking for a quote. They are clicking because they know accept defeat or get hit harder sounds like the kind of sentence you say when the current campaign has not yet forced the surrender you wanted. They are clicking because they can feel the war trying to push itself into a harder shape. And then you reach the part that turns this from a threat story into a strategic contradiction. A 5-point peace plan was reportedly sent to Iran by way of Pakistan. That means bombs and bargaining are now moving together. But this is not soft diplomacy arriving after violence. This looks more like violence trying to write the terms that diplomacy is then told to deliver. That matters because once a war enters that phase, the paper becomes part of the battlefield. The proposal is no longer just a route out. It is a test. Will Iran accept structural weakness under pressure? Will it reopen space the U.S. needs reopened? Will it emerge from this war visibly smaller, visibly weaker, visibly constrained? That is the kind of bargain Washington appears to want. And from Tehran's point of view, that is exactly why the offer looks poisonous. If the war ends with Iran publicly weakened on its nuclear posture, its missile posture, its regional reach, and its Hormuz leverage, then the regime does not just lose a round of fighting. It loses the political story that allows it to survive the round of fighting. That is why accept defeat is the lethal core of the title. It is asking for more than compliance. It is asking for self-negation. That is why Iran's reported counterposition matters so much. Tehran's side is not speaking like a government preparing to certify American victory. Its reported demands point the other way. Stop killing our officials. Guarantee no repeat war. Pay reparations, end hostilities, and leave our sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz intact. That is a wounded regime trying to turn survival itself into bargaining power. Now you can see the information war for what it really is. Washington gains by saying Iran is already defeated, because that makes rejection look irrational and more punishment look justified. Tehran gains by calling the U.S. offer deceptive and extreme, because that makes refusal look like dignity rather than desperation. Both sides are trying to seize control of the final meaning of the war before the war has actually settled. And the independent evidence sits in the middle like a knife. It supports severe Iranian degradation. It supports real mediator traffic. It supports Tehran's refusal to publicly behave like a vanquished state. It supports Washington's need for more than military damage. It supports the possibility that what looks like a peace push is really the extension of coercion into a political document. That is also why the war keeps finding new ways to stay dangerous. Once a conflict moves into this zone, every signal starts carrying two messages at once. More pressure can mean strength, or it can mean current pressure is not enough. Talks can mean diplomacy, or they can mean the battlefield failed to close the case cleanly. Warnings can mean control, or they can mean the side issuing them feels time and uncertainty closing in. And that is what most mainstream coverage leaves too soft. It keeps asking whether Trump wants a deal or wants escalation. The more precise question is whether Trump wants escalation because the only deal he can politically live with still looks too much like unfinished war. That is a much harsher reality, and it fits this title far better than the safe version ever could. Then the war drops out of the strategy room and lands where it always lands, on people who never got to write the headlines. How long will we stay like this? We are losing our sons every day. That line, spoken by the relative of a killed Iraqi soldier, is the human truth beneath all this rhetoric. While the great powers argue over who has been defeated, other families and other countries are already paying for the fact that nobody has actually closed the war. That is why the title's promise is bigger than Trump. This is not just a story about a president sounding tough. It is a story about what happens when a superpower has inflicted massive damage, but still has not secured the one political result that lets it safely stop. At that point, the temptation is always the same. Demand public surrender, raise the threat, and hope fear finishes what force began. So here's the honest answer to what the audience came for. If Trump's threat is fully real, then Washington is preparing for a harder phase because the damage already done has still not produced political submission. The line, "get hit harder than ever before," is not a flourish. It is the confession that current punishment has not yet delivered the ending the White House wants. And if part of it is bluff, if some of this is calculated Tehran language designed to frighten Tehran into accepting terms it otherwise would reject, the conclusion barely improves, because then the administration is using the vocabulary of overwhelming victory to hide an endgame that still looks unstable, still looks incomplete, and still depends on forcing the enemy to act defeated before the war has really stopped, proving it can spread. Either way, the same conclusion survives. A government that truly has the war wrapped up does not need the enemy to publicly certify it. It does not need to demand that the other side accept defeat. It does not need to threaten even bigger pain just to make the politics line up with the military story. That is the deepest implication of this title, and it is the one that should stay in your gut after the video ends. Accept defeat or get hit harder than ever before is not the language of relaxed dominance. It is the language of a power that has broken a lot, killed a lot, burned a lot, and still cannot safely say the war has ended on its terms. Stay with this channel. We follow the story at the point where the official version stops explaining what is really happening.